is the day of retribution.
911, what's the address of the emergency? Hello?
The day in which you have my revenge against humanity. You are animals, and I will slaughter you like animals.
My son caused so much pain and suffering for so many families.
Elliot Rodger, the Incel killer. He looked so unassuming, so normal, so incredibly ordinary. If he walked past you, you wouldn't even give him a second look or a moment's thought. But sadly, this was the problem. Filled with hate, emotions, and revenge, he would turn out to be a vicious killer, but would be celebrated by most people in his community. He would be seen as a martyr, a legend, a perfect semblance of what they stand for. Driven by loneliness, desire, low self-esteem, and self-sabotage, he would commit some of the worst atrocities known to man and would have zero remorse for it. His name was Elliot Rodger, and he was known as the King of Incels. But first, let's explain what incels are so you can understand the incels community and what they're all about. The inceldom. Incel is short for involuntary celibates, and they're essentially young heterosexual males who have a hard time getting women romantically and sexually involved with them. A struggle that they try to overcome for most of their life, but come up unsuccessful. As a result, they blame women for not looking their way and picking other young men over them. But they also like to take it a step further and blame the structure of society. They believe that society is structured in such a way men who have no depth or real substance are preferred by women to date and be intimate with. This infuriates incels a lot, as they feel they're more deserving, more worthy of the affection and intimacy with a woman. So the sadness they feel grows into anger, hate, and prejudice against women, society, and even the men these women choose to be with. A very popular term amongst members of this community is chads. Chads are young men who they consider to be the opposite of them. These chads do not have to work too hard to get girls around them. They seem to magnetize women, date them, and sleep with them. So ideally, incels hate chads as well. Another term they often use is Stacies. Quite simply, Stacies are the kinds of women incels would love to date. Beautiful, sexy, and desirable women. But sadly, to them, these Stacies are never interested in them. They're only interested in chads, and this fuels the anger they feel. But more relevantly, a lot of these incels express their hatred through violent means, or at least they have the tendency to be violent. In their online communities, they talk a lot about being violent, issue threats to society, chads, and Stacies. There have been some manifestations of these threats in real life where Stacies are targeted in terrible, violent acts. It is also noteworthy to mention that not all incels believe in violence, but the ones that do seem to outweigh the few that don't. Now this brings us to the most famous incel, a man named...
Hi, Elliot Rodger here.
The Incel King. He would go on to carry out the most infamous killing spree by an incel in May of 2014, ending the lives of about half a dozen people in one night. But how did he become this way? To understand that, we must first dig into the life of Elliot Rodger himself and go back to the beginning. Elliot Rodger's childhood. Born in England in 1991, Elliot had a surprisingly amazing childhood. He would build snowmen in the winter and play at the beach during summer. He was loved and adored by his parents, and they'd do anything for him. He lived with them in a beautiful countryside, and he would fly kites with his dad. They'd build such great memories that it was clear that Elliot was from a loving family. Soon enough, his parents had another child, a little girl named Georgia. Even Elliot later wrote in his journal that the memories of his childhood were purely that of happiness and bliss. When his father's movie-producing career took off, Elliot was only 5, and so they had to move to Los Angeles. They purchased a nice home and lived beautifully. But soon enough, it was time for Elliot to start school, kindergarten, and he was full of hopes. As a kindergartner, he made his first friend, which was surprisingly a girl. It was the first female friend he ever made, and sadly, it would be his last. As he interacted with a lot of other children in school, there became an underlying problem. He began to exhibit flashes of rage, jealousy, and vindictiveness. For example, in his class, there was another boy named Joey, and he and Elliot did not get along. As a matter of fact, Elliot hated Joey so much that when he turned 6, his parents threw him a huge party, and he made sure to invite everyone in his class. All except Joey. It was his way of getting back at Joey for making him feel small and sad, he later said. But even more seriously, Elliot began to notice some things regarding his body. He was becoming painfully aware of the fact that he was short and not as tall as the other boys in his class. However, Elliot brazed through it and tried to pretend this didn't make him feel horrible about himself. But one day, the awareness hit him like a freight train in a circumstance no child should ever have to face. He had seen the movie Jurassic Park, and Elliot loved it. In his little mind, he wished a park like that existed. He was fascinated by animals, dinosaurs, and the excitement that came with it. So imagine how his excitement grew even more when he heard there was a new Jurassic-themed park in town. He just had to go. Elliot begged his parents to take him, and of course they obliged. It was an exciting day for him. Sadly, it would also turn out to be one of the worst days of his life. He got on the line to ride the roller coaster, and it was a really long line. He patiently waited till it got to his turn, and just as he was about to be attended to by the staff, they stopped him and wouldn't let him on. Why? Because he was too short to get on, and so couldn't take the ride. Elliot immediately burst into a crying tantrum and was visibly upset. He watched all the other boys his age get admitted into the ride, but he couldn't get on. He couldn't believe that the ride he was dying to be on so much was forbidden to him, and only to him, for something he had no control over. As he went into a crying tantrum, his mother came in to soothe him and make it up to him, and this became the first of many from then on. Since that day, any other time Elliot didn't get what he wanted, he would throw a crying tantrum, and his mother would console him and do anything to make him feel better. He wasn't denied anything, but little did the mother know that this relationship they had was going to become a recipe for disaster and cause Elliot to become even worse in his adult years. But before then, another turning point came in Elliot's life, and it had to do with his parents' marriage. You see, as his father got deeper into Hollywood and his career took off some more, he spent less and less time with his family, and even Elliot didn't get to see his father more often. However, he still respected him and considered him a powerful and successful man. Sadly, his mother didn't seem to share the same sentiment, so when Elliot turned 7, his parents told him they were getting a divorce and going to be separated forever. Again, Elliot cried and cried. He couldn't believe this was happening. The fond memories he shared with his parents were about to be a distant past, and now he would have 2 homes and spend time with his parents separately. He hated this. To cap it all up, his father then went on to marry a younger actress from Morocco named Sanaya Akabone. But unlike his mother, Sanaya did not contain any of Elliot's excesses or crying tantrums, and he hated her for it. So much that he wished she would die. When he turned 9, he began to develop even more insecurities. He hated that he was not as tall as other boys. He even noticed that he was not just short, but feeble and physically weaker than boys younger than him. Almost every boy around him was physically stronger, and this vexed him to no end. On top of that, in school, he began to notice the cool kids, the cliques, and everything. He became aware that in the structure of the school system, He wasn't a cool kid, and he didn't belong to any clique. He felt like an outcast. He felt rage and jealousy. In his journal, he even noted that he was a jealous person by nature, and with all the things going on around him, his jealousy grew. When other kids refused to play with him, he felt jealous and started crying. Even when his childhood female friend began to get closer to his sister than to him, he felt jealous too and would start crying. As usual, his mother would run in to comfort him and soothe him while his father's new girlfriend would not accommodate the tantrums. When he threw one or acted badly, she would tell him off, scold him, or punish him. His resentment for her grew. But more importantly, Elliot began to understand the social hierarchy in his middle school. Not only was he upset that he wasn't one of the cool kids, he began to form a lasting hatred for them. He tried to hide his disgust as much as he could, but he felt that they were stupid, obnoxious jerks, and more annoyingly, these same boys were the ones that pretty girls in his school flocked to. It just wasn't fair. So he began to form a dangerous opinion about how the world was a brutal place, an unfair place for him to be in. How could those jerks get the girls, and he could not? He tried to be like them, but it wasn't working, and this made him hate and resent them even more. He realized that how his father trained him wasn't working in the real world. According to his journal, his father trained him to be kind and polite, to see the good in people and treat people with respect. But in the real world, kind and polite people never win. They're not desires. They're not part of cliques. No one wants to associate themselves with people like that. But rather, the rude and impolite jerks keep having girls and friends flock to them rather than to him. How could this be? Moving forward, Elliot felt a sense of inferiority to the Chads and Stacys around him. He couldn't even compare to them and hated that. Girls had zero reaction to him and all positive reactions when it's a Chad. But to make matters worse, Elliot recalled one encounter that made his inferiority even more pronounced. He recalls that he bumped into a girl in school one day, and even though it was an honest mistake, she was rude to him. She called him names and insulted him. She was harsh, brutal, and mean. Was this the only type of reaction he could get from women? Was he that annoying and undesirable? Would she feel the same way if she bumped into a Chad? These feelings began to take root deep in Elliot's heart, and he resented everyone in school. He couldn't handle it. As a result, he asked his parents to change schools so he could start fresh. But when they did, Elliot faced the same level of harshness, bullying, and nonchalance from others. He would go on to change schools several times after that, but it did nothing to change the situation. Even when it was time for high school, Elliot begged his parents to put him in an all-boys school. He didn't want to have to deal with girls again, or see them, or interact with them. Maybe in an all-boys school, he would fare better. His dad drove him there on his first day, and even before he got out of the car, Elliot began to cry again and told his dad he couldn't do it. He saw all the big and strong high school boys, and he was really small compared to them. And at that point, he wished he would disappear. Eventually, Elliot walked out of the car and into the school, and it turned out to be the worst experience of his life. He was bullied a lot and considered weird and unseeable. Kids would tease him, laugh at him, and even throw food at him during lunchtime. He was weird, weak, small, and short. He was helpless. He couldn't fight back. All he could do was sulk. Sometimes they'd also steal his belongings and run. In anger and rage, he would chase them, but never catch them. To him, he was fighting for his life, trying to survive in high school. But to the rest of the bullies, it was simply comical messing with him because he was so weak and short. But his discoveries of women and how they operate would imbibe in him even more hatred as he grew older. One of the situations that added to this was one time where his family spent some time with their relatives. They were having dinner on the table when Elliot's cousin was talking to him. Later that night, the cousin's girlfriend came over and the two lovebirds became intimate in Elliot's presence. They were kissing and touching while Elliot watched. They were oblivious to his presence, and this annoyed him the more. Did they know he was there? Keep in mind that Elliot was 16 at this time, and his cousin was only 12. It made Elliot so jealous and angry that a 12-year-old could get the girls, but he couldn't. What was he doing wrong? How did it get this bad? He wanted to yell at them, tell them he hated them, but he sat there and resented them for what they did. After that encounter, Elliot began to hate seeing lovebirds and couples around. These girls should be more interested in him and not them. He was handsome too. The beginning of deep hatred. One strange thing that Elliot began to feel was deserving of these girls, entitled even. He began to put more effort into how he looked, how he smelled, and how handsome he was. He would record videos of himself and send them to his incel community, telling them how annoyed he feels,
I've been through college,
how he hates women.
and yet I'm still a virgin.
One time, he sent a message to the group where he said he'd like a world where every beautiful woman was kept at a concentration camp and starved to death so they could slowly die. A few other women would be preserved for procreation and continued existence of mankind only. If the offspring is a girl, they'll be sent to the camps, but boys would be spared. Eventually, according to him, there would be a new world of men who aren't infected by women and who have no ties with women and do not know about them. That would be a perfect world, Elliot opined. He hated women so much, but one more circumstance made his hatred even 10 times worse. In college, Elliot had an African-American roommate, and one day, as they were talking, he told Elliot he lost his virginity to a blonde girl. Elliot froze. He couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't believe that even a black man would get beautiful girls, and he couldn't. It became obvious that Elliot was racist, even though he was half British and half Asian. He couldn't fathom why a woman would find someone like his roommate attractive enough to sleep with. He wrote in his journal how mad that made him feel, and he was convinced that the world was unfair and brutal. Women were sick, unfair, and terrible beings. He wrote that his roommate was a descendant of slaves and he was a much better choice, but they'd rather sleep with the roomie than him. Pure hatred grew, and violent tendencies began to grow as well. The day of retribution. Up to this point, Elliot has never been violent with any woman or any couple. But one day, he went to get a Starbucks coffee
Vanilla latte.
and was walking back to his car when he came across a couple walking too. They were holding hands and kissing as they walked. Elliot was filled with envy, hatred, and jealousy. So before he knew it, he ran after them and spilled his drink all over them on purpose. Then he ran away as the man chased him. He was eventually able to get away from the man, but that encounter gave him such a rush. It dawned on him that he could hurt these couples. He could make them feel pain. Pain for how they treated him, how small they made him feel. At this point,
Hi,
a sinister
Elliot
plan
Rodger
was
here.
born. Elliot was going to go on a murderous rampage, and so he
this is it.
planned his next move.
This is my last video.
He called it the Day
It all has
of
to
Retribution.
come to this.
A day where he would finally
Tomorrow
get back at all the
is the
Chads
day
and
of
Stacys who
retribution.
made his life miserable.
The day that I will finally be able to have my revenge against humanity.
But this is where the story gets even more intense. Detailed graphically in his journal were the atrocious acts he would carry out. It was more than just getting revenge. It was about preventing any more fraternization between men and women around him. He wanted to put a stop to it. Forever. And so, the day of retribution was spelt out in 3 phases. Phase 1. He was going to murder his roommates so he could have the whole apartment to himself. Why? Because he intended to invite attractive people over where he would torture and brutally end the lives of anyone who attended. But if you think you have heard the worst of his plans, think again. Because Phase 2 was where he was going to execute his revenge on women. According to a video he later sent to his incel community group, he was going to enter the hottest sorority house in his college, then slaughter every beautiful woman he came across. Then he would burn down the entire house before moving on to the final phase of his plans. Phase 3 would involve him ending the lives of his younger brother and stepmom. Now, there is no question why he hated his stepmom, but why his younger brother? Well, even though Elliot loved his brother, he was consumed with the feeling that the younger Rodger would grow up to have more friends, more girls, and be generally more social than him. It was a thought he couldn't bear to abide. Then he would drive his father's car, a bigger one than his own, and drive down the street to run down as many people as he possibly could until police officers arrived at the scene, at which point he would take his own life. With that, his plan was complete. So on Friday night, May 23rd, Elliot executed his plan by going to a sorority house to set fire to the entire place. He wanted every Chad and Stacy in there to burn and die a slow and painful death. But thankfully, he wasn't allowed in. However, Elliot will not be deterred. He got into his car and proceeded to knock down as many people as he came across in the street, just as he planned. By the end of the night, Elliot had killed up to 6 innocent people and injured 14 others. And after he had done all these, he pulled out a gun, turned it on himself, and pulled the trigger, taking his own life. This may have ended the life of the incel killer, but it was the beginning of the town mourning their dead and an awareness to the dark, twisted mentality of some of the people in the incel community. Either way, the town would never remain the same again.